Hey guys, how you doing today? Just on my way home from work. Chilly day today. Fall is upon us. Beautiful day though, even with the crispness of the air. Beautiful day. Um, I'm gonna entitle this one "A Brief History of Wage Slavery." Uh, One of the big delusions that's going on in uh, the right and in capitalist circles generally is that we are in the end of history, that this is the best that we can do. And I feel like lots of people just kind of go along their day, and because everybody is sort of in the same boat, so to speak, everyone is a wage earner in some way. You have salary earners, then you have hourly workers, sure, but everybody is earning a wage, and the entire system is built around wages. And so everyone thinks to themselves, oh, this is normal, this is how things are supposed to be. And I'd like to kind of go through, starting with the inception of capitalism and to the modern day, as quickly as I can, where wages come from, why we think wages are a good way to organize the society, and sort of the history of wage slavery. So, in and around the 17th century, or the 1700s, I suck with that. I'm going to be straight up. Like the 1700s is the 18th century, or the I'm always terrible at that. So in and around the 1700s, up until that point, you have kings and queens and lords and vassals and things like this, right? It's a monarchical system, generally speaking, across Europe. Serfs operate under lords. Serfs actually do operate in a market system. One of the great lies that capitalists propagate is that one of the great strengths of capitalism is markets, and markets exist in pretty much any system, right? There are slave systems that have had markets. There are slave markets, for God's sakes. Like, markets are not capitalism. They have nothing to do with capitalism. So serfs trade amongst one another in a market system, right? The currency that they use to distribute amongst one another are tally sticks, right? This is actually an incredibly stable economic system where there is a set amount of tally sticks that are distributed among the serf population. The serfs distribute them amongst one another, right? It's a good way to kind of keep, to make sure you avoid things like hoarding, or you avoid things like people buying up a huge quantity of something, to just give them a limited supply of tally sticks to see to what they need to have. Annually, there's some kind of festival or feast or something, and the tally sticks are all brought back to the king, who has a tally stick that has a series of notches in it, which align with the amount of tally sticks. And this is done to avoid counterfeiting, right? So nobody can cheat the system. And then he takes all the sticks and he redistributes them, right? Because they understood that in a market system of any sort, there is going to be a consolidation. Eventually, all of these tally sticks sort of fall into the same sort of groups and hands. And that's no good, because you want to have a system that actually flows. And so they brought it all in and they redistributed it. This system operates without collapse or difficulty for 700 years, right? There are no records and no recording of any kind of economic collapse under this sort of feudal system. So eventually, the merchants and manufacturers begin to gain power, right? The merchants and manufacturers, of course, are rising from the lords needing to trade with one another, right? So you have the lords and the ladies and all of this. They're trading with one another, but they need a place to do that. And so you would have like a general meeting point where they would all come together and meet. And this is done at bridges and common meeting spots. known as fairs, right? And that's also where you would have large festivals and things like this. And so smiths, people who ply their trade, would go to these festivals. But eventually they would start to settle at these points, right? And they would begin to really make they would settle there, and they would make that their home. So they're no longer living on the Lord's land. They're living on their own land, right? And this is where the merchants and manufacturers begin to get their power. So they begin, because they begin to increase their power and begin to get more power even than the lords and the ladies, right? Because they are the distributors of goods. They are the ones who have the knowledge. They are where the guilds start to pop up, all this sort of stuff. And eventually there comes a point where the merchants and manufacturers start to see the lords and ladies as an impediment. They start to look at them and say, like, why are you in the way? Why do I need to negotiate with you whenever I want access to your labor, which is the serfs, right? And so they begin to negotiate with the lords and the ladies in order to get their land, right? And the way that serfdom works is that if you buy the land, you get the serfs, right? The serfs come with the land. Now, historically, the feudal system, the expectation was that a lord would gain access to the land, or be transferred the land, or be bequeathed the land, or would purchase the land and get the serfs, and just expect them to do what they've been doing, right? No significant change to the way that they operate. The serfs would just continue working the land. But because there's been technological improvements, because there's been increases in the productivity of the serf, they just need less serfs. So what the merchants and manufacturers begin to do, and this is the inception of capitalism right here, they gain access to the land from the lords and the ladies, right? And then they force the serfs off the land into the factories. Now, of course, William Blake writes about this beautifully, in my view. Of course, the serfs are not treated well, as you can imagine. Capitalism never treats workers well. You have to fight for everything you get from capitalism. And so these workers are paid a wage. Now, here's the scam that capitalism will always play on the working class. And they do it consistently, as you'll see. So the workers are paid a wage, but the manufacturers and merchants often also control the food and rent required for living and shelter and eating and all of that. And so generally speaking, the price of food and shelter is equal to, or more than, in many cases, the wage that the capitalist is paying. Now, this forces the worker to take on debt, right? And this is where debtors' prisons come from. This is where all this stuff arises from, is because workers are forced into a position where the wage that they're earning is less than the food and shelter required, right? And this is done, of course, to scare the hell out of the workers and to keep them compliant and in line. Now, while this, of course, is happening, the capitalist class is committing a genocide across North America in order to steal as much land as possible from the people who are living on that land, conquering the people that lived there, and wiping them out systematically, right? While simultaneously enslaving African people in order to force them onto plantations to do work and build the American society, right? So they have a couple of different types of slavery going on. They have chattel slavery, which is just the direct ownership of the slave, but wage slavery has been in existence during this period of time as well. That will pay you a wage, and it will be less than the food and shelter that we will also control, right? And we control all of this through a market, right? The market system is always been in use during this period of time, because you can claim that you have a free market if you own it, right? Which the merchants and manufacturers do. Now, so this continues throughout the United States, because now we're moving into the United States history. And there is a brutal union history and a brutal labor struggle that occurs throughout the United States after the Civil War. Now, the Civil War is an interesting point in history because it is a point where America wanted to rid itself of chattel slavery, which it was correct in saying was a stain, right? That the Southerners didn't want to get rid of the slaves because it's very powerful to have an army of people doing your work for you for nothing, right? But there's this wonderful book called, and it's, wonderful, but it's a horrific book, but it's a wonderful book called Cotton is King. It's a group of essays that were written by Southerners who were in favor of slavery. It's the pro-slavery argument. And one of the things that the pro-slavery apologists said was that, well, if you get rid of chattel slavery, you'll just make them wage slaves, right? So it was well understood that what people were doing was wage slavery, that wage slavery existed, that wage slavery was part of our history. And they said that chattel slavery was actually more moral than wage slavery, because once the work dried up, the owner of the chattel slave still had to feed and clothe the chattel slave. Whereas if the work dried up for the wage slave, the owner of the wage slave could simply abandon him, which is exactly what happens under wage slavery. So the Civil War occurs, and after the Civil War, you have an incredible period of unionization, of people coming together, attempting to get a better deal for themselves. And you get absolutely brutal stories, like the first aerial bombardment in America, on American soil, was done by a corporation on unionizing workers. And the labor history in the United States is absolutely vicious and brutal. And you have periods of time where it's outright warfare just so that people can get a better deal than what they're getting. And this is where we get things like the 5-day work week, right? This is where we get the 40-hour work week, paid time, sick days, things like this. And this basically continues until the World Wars. And once World War II hits, you have an entire generation of people who go through the horrors of World War II. And World War II is absolutely a horrific period of time. But it showed without the shadow of a doubt that the government can restructure the society in order to fulfill objectives. And so post-World War II, people expected that to happen, right? This is where you have the whole concept of the New Deal, right? The capitalist class had driven the economy into the ground and created the Great Depression through simple money hoarding, right? That's how you get depressions. Just you hoard all the wealth for yourself. No one can do anything because there's no circulation actually happening. Your economy is dead because the blood is not flowing, the money's not flowing. And so again, after World War II, you have this incredible labor movement that happens, and it's one of the most heavily organized in the history of the United States, right? The socialists and the communists have come together in order to fight against the capitalists. Oh boy, what a terrible time to blank on this guy's name. Eisenhower? No, Roosevelt. There we go, I did it. Roosevelt, who created the New Deal and created a genuine middle class in the United States, said that his greatest success is that he saved capitalism. How did he save capitalism? Well, he allowed the powerful to maintain their positions of power. They still owned everything. They still owned the land, right? They still owned all of that stuff. And the wage slaves, who had been doing all the work this whole time while receiving a wage, just got a better deal. They were still wage slaves. They were still in the same position, but they just got a better deal. So after the World War II period, and after we get into the 60s and the 70s, and the 70s were a very dangerous time for capitalism because it was a moment when the workers almost took complete control over the capitalist system. Capitalists had almost completely lost all of their power. And so it forced them through a concerted effort, right? You had the neoliberals came in. That's Reagan, Thatcher, Mulrooney. And they restructured the society through a trade deal they called NAFTA, right? And what this let them do is it let them ship all of their manufacturing away from their own nations into places like China, places like India. And so it forced workers in their own places to compete with China and India, where there's like true slavery. Like slavery is still happening in the truest sense. They don't have the laws or the same sort of struggle that has happened. That's beginning to happen now, but it hasn't happened. So I've got to come to a close here, but I'll close by saying, like, you're receiving a wage, you're still a wage slave, right? All the benefits that you have exist through bloody struggle and fight. And that's just the history of it. But the glimmering light of it all is that labor typically wins, right? That if labor organizes and they actually go on strike and they actually cause problems for the capitalist class, they generally get what they want. And it is possible in our lifetimes that we could get rid of capitalism and get rid of these capitalists. But we need to take a look at history. We need to relearn the history of the lineage of our wage slavery. We need to accept that we are wage slaves. And we need to organize and come forward with a method to rid ourselves of our slavers. Okay, guys, that's the end of me. I hope you're doing well out there. Good luck, Godspeed. Go meet your neighbors. Have fun.